right now, I mean, half the globe is on the brink of this massive energy crisis that could just shut down factories overnight.
Oh, easily.
Yeah. Yet somehow, the exact markets that conventional wisdom says should be crashing the hardest, they're actually surging to record highs. Welcome to the deep dive, everyone.
Thanks for joining us.
If you're watching our 24/7 stream right now on NovaStream, you are looking at a bizarre, totally contradictory dashboard. Over in the breaking news feed, geopolitical alarms are just flashing red.
Right.
But right next to it, you look at our live crypto spark lines and the tech indices, and they are practically melting upward in brilliant green. So today is Wednesday, April 22, 2026, and our mission today is to connect the dots between these escalating Middle East tensions, this gravitational surge in artificial intelligence investments, and ultimately what this massive divergence means for your wallet. So, okay, let's unpack this. We have to start with the flashing red indicators on the geopolitical feed.
We do. And to understand the baseline tension driving the tape today, we really have to look at the latest developments between the U.S. and Iran.
Right. The big story today.
Exactly. The major headline coming across the wire is that the peace talks, which were scheduled to take place in Pakistan today, those have officially collapsed.
Wow.
Yeah. But President Donald Trump has extended the current ceasefire, which provides what basically amounts to a very tense, very fragile holding pattern right now.
Yeah, and the U.S. blockade of Iranian ports is still holding.
It is.
But I'm looking at the maritime tracking data from the intelligence firm Kepler, and it paints a very different picture behind the scenes. Iran is actively loading crude oil onto their massive tankers.
They are, yeah.
Like, they know the oil can't physically pass through the Strait of Hormuz right now because of the blockade, but they're basically positioning themselves to be the first ships out of the gate.
Exactly. Ready to sell to those supply-starved buyers the second that waterway reopens. It's a high-stakes waiting game. And before we look at the specific chess moves by Donald Trump, Joe Biden, or Xi Jinping regarding this standoff, I do want to make something very clear to you, the listener.
Oh, absolutely. Let's lay the ground rules.
Right. Today, we are purely analyzing the market mechanics found in our source data. We are absolutely not taking political sides here, whether left-wing or right-wing. We are not endorsing the actions of any of these nations or leaders, be it the U.S., Iran, Israel, or China.
Exactly. We're strictly reporting the analysis provided in the sources and just following the money.
Exactly. Just looking at how the market reacts.
Right. We're just reading the tape. And looking at the mechanics of this oil standoff, there's this very prevalent assumption floating around.
Yeah.
Like, since the U.S. is a massive net exporter of petroleum products, the general public tends to look at this crisis and just assume we're insulated.
Oh, 100%.
Right. The thought process is that China, which is heavily reliant on foreign energy, is extremely vulnerable to a supply chokehold, while the U.S. can just sort of shrug off the disruption.
That is the conventional wisdom, sure. But Marco Papek, he's a geopolitical strategist from BCA Research, he completely dismantled that idea on the Geopolitical Cousins podcast yesterday with Jacob Shapiro.
Oh, yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, Papek went so far as to call the idea that the U.S. could comfortably cut off China's oil supply and starve them out. He called it stupid, stupid, stupid.
Wait, really? Stupid, stupid, stupid. That's a strong statement, because on paper, China's reliance on energy imports looks like a massive Achilles heel. Walk me through the mechanism there. How do they actually survive a blockade in the Middle East?
Well, China has structurally insulated itself through three major defensive layers.
Okay.
First is their radical diversification and use of the gray market. If U.S. policy blocks direct shipments from Iran or, say, Venezuela, China doesn't just sit there. They pivot to Russia, they buy from the Saudis, or they utilize what the industry calls shadow fleets.
Okay, shadow fleets. I've seen that term pop up on the commodities feed. How exactly does a shadow fleet operate in practice? I mean, it sounds like pirate radio, but for oil.
It kind of is. It operates largely in international waters, heavily concentrated off the coast of places like Malaysia. You basically have these aging tankers that intentionally turn off their automatic tracking transponders.
Wow, just going dark.
Literally going dark. They meet up with other ships in the middle of the ocean and conduct these ship-to-ship transfers of crude oil. They mix different grades of oil, falsify the origin paperwork, reflag the vessels, and then just sail the cargo into Chinese ports.
That's insane.
And because oil is a fungible commodity, right, the second it gets blended at sea, it becomes nearly impossible to trace its origin. If Iran can't legally sell to China, they sell to a shadow middleman, which, ultimately feeds the Chinese market anyway.
So the supply chain just routes around the geopolitical damage like water around a rock. That's layer one. What are the other defensive layers?
The second is centralized state planning. In a free market, a decentralized web of privately owned refineries relies on price signals to adjust operations. But China operates state-controlled refineries.
Right.
And because different regions of the world produce different grades of crude oil, some are heavy and sour, some are light, and sweet refineries actually have to be physically calibrated to process them.
Okay.
China's top-down control means they can mandate infrastructure retooling incredibly fast. They can adapt their facilities to refine whatever specific grade of crude they can source from the shadow fleet much faster than a decentralized market could.
Makes sense.
But the third point is perhaps the most critical. Do you remember April of 2020 when oil prices famously dropped below zero?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Producers were literally paying buyers to take barrels off their hands because global demand just evaporated overnight during the pandemic lockdowns.
Right. Well, while the rest of the world was panicking over storage space, China was quietly executing the greatest commodity trade of the century. They bought everything they could get their hands on. Shapiro actually estimates they accumulated around 1.2 billion barrels.
Wait, I have to stop you there. Physically, where do you put 1.2 billion barrels of oil? Like, that is not just a few extra steel tanks sitting behind a refinery.
No, it requires monumental infrastructure. We're talking about massive strategic petroleum reserve facilities, huge coastal tank farms, and get this, specialized underground salt caverns that have been hollowed out specifically to hold liquid energy.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they essentially build an underground ocean of oil. That 1.2 billion barrels translates to about 104 days of full, unadulterated storage capacity for the entire nation.
See, that completely flips the narrative. So it's like assuming you can starve out a neighbor by blocking their front door, totally unaware that they have spent the last 3 years building a fully stocked underground bunker and, 3 back doors. But let's push back on this and flip the focus to the United States. Even if China is deeply insulated, why does PAPIC argue that the U.S. is the one actually vulnerable here? I mean, we pump millions of barrels out of the Permian Basin every single day.
Well, this is where we need to clarify a crucial mismatch in American infrastructure. PAPIC highlights that while the U.S. is a net exporter of refined products like gasoline and diesel, we are actually a net importer of raw crude oil.
Okay, I need to explain, I'm 5 on that. If we are producing record amounts of energy domestically, why on earth are we importing crude oil from anywhere else?
It comes down to chemistry and the age of our infrastructure. The oil that the U.S. currently pumps out of shale fields is generally light sweet crude, which is easy to refine.
Right.
However, the massive multi-billion-dollar refineries along the U.S. Gulf Coast were primarily built decades ago, and they were specifically engineered to process heavy, sour crude coming from places like Venezuela, Mexico, and the Middle East.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, it takes billions of dollars and years of construction to change a refinery's diet. So the U.S. exports the light sweet crude we pump out of the ground because our own legacy refineries aren't optimized for it. And then we import the heavy sour crude to feed the machines we actually have.
That is fascinating. So we are energy independent on paper, but mechanically we are still completely tied to the global heavy crude market.
Exactly. And furthermore, under both the Biden and Trump administrations, the U.S. aggressively released millions of barrels from our own strategic petroleum reserves to artificially dampen domestic gas prices and fight inflation. The U.S. has basically been emptying its bunker while China has been filling theirs.
Which brings us to the ultimate consequence. So what? If oil spikes globally because the Strait of Hormuz remains locked down, how does that translate to the actual American economy?
Well, this raises the fundamental difference between the two economies. Energy production is less than 10% of U.S. GDP. It only employs about 5% of the workforce. But consumer spending, everyday people buying groceries, cars, and electronics, that makes up almost 75% of the U.S. economy. If a geopolitical disruption sends gas prices soaring to $6.50 a gallon in California or $4 in the Midwest, American consumers immediately have less discretionary capital to spend on everything else.
Right. The fundamental engine of the economy just stalls out because everyone is just paying at the pump, which implies Trump actually has more to lose from energy spikes than Xi Jinping does.
Absolutely. Because of that 75% reliance on the consumer, Papik and Shapiro argue that the U.S. actually has far more to lose economically from a sudden energy shock than China does.
Wow.
And Shapiro makes one final, incredibly stark point regarding the interdiction scenario. If the U.S. somehow magically succeeded in cutting off China from every single drop of global oil, freezing their economy entirely, Americans would face immediate, severe punishment.
Because the factories powering American consumerism would go dark. The daily goods, the electronics, the textiles that Americans rely on, which are overwhelmingly manufactured in Chinese facilities, they would simply stop arriving at U.S. ports. So Americans would be really screwed.
Precisely. The supply chain is too interwoven for one side to inflict fatal damage without catching the shrapnel.
Okay, so if the U.S. consumer is that vulnerable to a global energy shock, and we're currently staring down a highly volatile standoff in the Middle East, logic dictates that the markets most reliant on imported energy should be collapsing.
You'd think so.
Right. But I am looking at the global indices on our NovaStream dashboard right now, and the data is showing the exact opposite. Emerging markets are somehow flashing bright green.
It is one of the most counterintuitive divergences we have seen in years.
The trend on the dashboard is undeniable. I mean, the emerging market indices are crushing the U.S. domestic market. Let me pull up the specific ETF data. The iShares Core MSCI Emerging Markets ETF, ticker IEMG, it's up 13.7% in 2026 through this past Tuesday. Yeah. Meanwhile, the S&P 500 is only up 3.2% for the year. I mean, we did see the U.S. market outperform briefly in March, right after the U.S. and Israel attacked Iran back on February 28th. But the second April hit, emerging markets, and along with Japan's Nikkei 225, actually they rocketed back to the top of the leaderboards. What is the mechanism driving that?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, to understand why these markets are ignoring the geopolitical gravity of the oil crisis, we have to look under the hood of those funds. Gargi Chaudhuri from BlackRock and Adam Turnquist from LPL Financial have both released analyses on this exact phenomenon.
Okay, what'd they find?
Well, investors are flooding capital into emerging markets for two distinct reasons. The first is a simple valuation play. Emerging market equities have been beaten down for years and are trading at incredibly cheap multiples compared to U.S. megacaps.
Sure, buy low.
Right. But the second, and far more powerful reason, is that these markets offer massive concentrated exposure to the artificial intelligence boom.
Wait, hang on. When the average retail investor thinks about AI stocks, they picture Silicon Valley.
Naturally, yeah.
They think about the Magnificent Seven U.S. tech giants. How are emerging markets driving the AI story?
Because the software revolution is entirely bottlenecked by physical hardware. Chaudhuri points out a staggering statistic. 42% of that specific IEMG Emerging Markets ETF is allocated purely to technology and artificial intelligence companies.
Really?
Yeah.
42%.
Yeah. Turnquist elaborates that the emerging market story is no longer just about cheap Chinese manufacturing and textiles. Taiwan and South Korea have positioned themselves as the absolute engines of the global AI build-out.
Ah, because they're the ones actually fabricating the chips.
Precisely. You cannot train a large language model without advanced memory chips, custom silicon wafers, and incredibly complex physical infrastructure. Taiwan and South Korea are manufacturing the physical picks and shovels for the AI gold rush.
Right.
Because the demand from U.S. software companies is so astronomical, the earnings growth for these Asian hardware manufacturers has been revised meaningfully higher over the last few quarters. Their corporate profits are surging so violently that it is completely overriding the macroeconomic drag of higher oil prices.
So if emerging markets are insulated by this tech hardware boom, that implies the demand coming from U.S. big tech is voracious enough to offset a global energy crisis.
It really is.
What exactly are the U.S. giants building that requires this unprecedented level of capital expenditure?
Well, they are basically fighting an existential war for the foundational layer of the next technological era. The analysts are calling these massive tech companies the generals of the stock market right now.
Generals, I like that.
Yeah, the information technology sector alone is projected to account for an unbelievable 63% of the S&P 500's total earnings growth this year.
Wow, 63% from one sector.
One single sector is doing the heavy lifting for the entire U.S. market. And the sheer scale of the AI transition is forcing the most valuable companies on Earth to restructure their leadership and their core business models.
And we saw a massive piece of that restructuring hit the wire on Monday. Apple officially announced that Tim Cook is stepping down as CEO on September 1st. handing the reins over to John Ternus.
Yep.
And the market reaction was wildly bullish. I saw Wall Street analyst Dan Ives published a note calling Ternus the new sheriff and slapped a massive $350 price target on the stock. Analysts out of Yale are publishing op-eds saying Ternus is the absolute perfect chief executive for the AI era.
Yeah, and what makes that reaction so telling is John Ternus's actual background.
Yeah.
He's a 25-year veteran at Apple, but he is fundamentally a hardware engineer.
Right.
He is the executive who successfully oversaw the massive, highly complex transition of Mac computers away from Intel processors to Apple's own custom silicon.
Here's where it gets really interesting. That choice of leadership is a massive strategic signal. It's like swapping out the captain of a $4 trillion ocean liner right as you navigate into a massive, uncharted AI storm. And Wall Street is somehow just cheering from the docks.
That's exactly what's happening.
It signals that the conceptual phase of AI is over, and solving the physical hardware bottleneck is now the only thing that matters. Wall Street is cheering because they realize that winning the AI war isn't just about writing the best code. It is about controlling the actual glass and metal devices that deliver that code to the user.
That is exactly the calculation. Controlling the hardware means controlling the distribution of AI. And Apple isn't the only giant aggressively maneuvering in the physical space. Google just unveiled its 8th generation custom silicon chips.
Oh, the TPUs.
Right, their tensor processing units. They announced the TPU-8T, which is designed specifically for training massive AI models, meaning the computationally heavy process of feeding the AI the entire internet so it can learn. But more importantly, they introduced the TPO-AI, which is built for inference.
And inference being the actual real-time generation.
Right.
Like when I type a prompt into an AI, inference is the processing power required to spit out the answer.
Correct. Training is reading the textbook, inference is taking the test.
Got it.
By building these highly specialized 8th generation chips, Google is issuing a direct targeted challenge to NVIDIA's total dominance in the semiconductor market. Google realizes that relying entirely on a third party for the physical chips necessary to run their core business is an unacceptable risk. They're trying to control their own destiny by vertically integrating their silicon.
Then you look at software giants like Adobe, who are fighting a completely different front of this war. The market has coined this term, the SaaSpocalypse, the fear that traditional software-as-a-service business models will be completely decimated by AI. The theory is that if an AI can just generate a logo or edit a video or write code from scratch, why would anyone pay a monthly subscription for Adobe Photoshop?
And Adobe is combating that narrative by betting roughly a quarter of its massive corporate valuation on the idea that AI can be integrated as a defensive moat rather than an existential threat. They are deeply embedding generative AI directly into their existing software workflows.
So it complements the business instead of destroying it.
Exactly. Their strategy is to make their tools so fast and so powerful that the workflow itself becomes indispensable. All of these massive corporate pivots, these billions of dollars in hardware expenditures, they recently pushed the S&P 500 past the historic 7,000 milestone. We saw it sitting at 7,064 just yesterday. The capital flowing into the upper echelon of the market is almost unfathomable.
But, the NovaStream dashboard isn't just tracking big tech indices, it's tracking the entire economy. We just outlined trillion-dollar corporate hardware bets and global superpowers hoarding billions of barrels of crude oil in underground caverns. How is the everyday person, the consumer, who makes up that vital 75% of the U.S. economy, actually holding up under the weight of all this?
The microeconomic data paints a starkly different, much darker picture than the S&P 500. While the tech indices soar, we just received a quarterly earnings report from Capital One, the massive Virginia-headquartered bank that serves as a primary issuer of everyday consumer credit cards.
Right.
They just reported a shocking 72% year-over-year jump in their provisions for credit losses. They completely missed Wall Street's consensus expectations.
Let's translate that banking jargon for everyone. What exactly does a massive jump in a provision for credit losses signify for the real economy?
Well, in bank accounting, a provision for credit losses is an expense line item. It's money the bank proactively sets aside to cover loans they expect will default. It means Capital One's internal risk algorithms looked at the millions of everyday Americans using their credit cards, analyzed their payment behaviors, and calculated a 72% increase in the amount of debt that will simply never be repaid.
That is terrifying.
It's the ultimate canary in the coal mine for consumer distress. It shows that beneath the surface of the AI boom, people are increasingly relying on high-interest credit just to fund their basic daily lives, and they're hitting their breaking point.
The disconnect on the dashboard is just jarring, because right next to Capital One's massive bad debt warning, I'm looking at the live crypto tracker. Bitcoin just hit an 11-week high. The crypto markets surged entirely on the optimism over Trump extending the Iran ceasefire. So you have equities pushing past historic milestones, Bitcoin breaking out alongside equities, and AI hardware companies seeing record profits.
And that is the ultimate paradox of today's market. On one side of the ledger, you have tech stocks and cryptocurrencies acting as turbocharged growth vehicles, seemingly detached from traditional economic gravity. Institutional capital is treating these assets as structural safe havens. Yeah.
But on the other side, the Capital One data reveals the grim reality at the ground level. The everyday consumer, the literal engine required to keep the American economy moving, is dangerously tapped out, buried under historic debt, just trying to keep the lights on.
Which brings us full circle on this deep dive. Today, we've tracked the flow of global capital from underground Chinese oil bunkers and the shadowy logistics of ocean-bound energy fleets, all the way to Taiwan's undisputed dominance in manufacturing the physical nervous system of artificial intelligence. We watched Apple appoint a hardware sheriff to navigate the AI software storm, and we ended by crashing straight into the uncomfortable reality of mounting consumer defaults.
It is a profoundly complex landscape. And I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over as you watch these tickers update on NovaStream.
Let's hear it.
We're observing a historic economic divergence play out in real time. Right now, trillions of dollars are being marshaled by big tech to build incredibly advanced artificial intelligence agents systems that can think, reason, and optimize at light speed.
But simultaneously, the average human consumer is taking on historic debt just to keep the economic engine running. If, as the data shows, consumption drives 75% of the U.S. economy, but all the capital investment is flowing exclusively into building AI infrastructure, what happens to the market when those brilliant AI agents finally wake up, look around, and realize they have absolutely nothing left to sell to a tapped-out, bankrupt human consumer?
We're basically building the ultimate trillion-dollar sales machine at the exact moment the buyer runs entirely out of cash. That is a chilling structural paradox to end on. Remember that image of the dashboard as you go about your day? The warning lights flashing red with global conflict and consumer debt, while the tech and crypto dials spin wildly upward into the green.
Thank you for joining us on today's Deep Dive. Keep your eyes on the NovaStream feed, keep questioning the narrative behind the headlines, and we will see.